So we've got plenty of bad stuff going on. We've got plenty of foolishness.
Right.
And while President Trump may well be the standard bearer for all things foolish and
Criminal.
say that for sure, and harmful to working people.
Trickle down.
The fact of the matter is, the problems we face, they've gotten worse of late, but they're problems that have been in the making and developing for close to 40 years. I'm running for Congress, not as a Joe Manchin Democrat. I almost said Republican. I'm not running as a Joe Manchin Democrat, and I'm not running as a Nancy Pelosi Democrat. I'm running as a working guy, a working guy who believes in working people, who believes in ordinary people, who believes in local communities. I'm running because I actually believe that there's such a thing as a rural progressive. And that both the Republican and Democratic establishments would be shocked if we could get a few rural progressives in the United States Congress. We would begin to... So I'm running more on hope and more on what I believe in than on the nonsense I'd like to try to help stop. Because the well of dreadfulness is too deep, and I could see myself getting swallowed up in it. So my focus, if you help me win this primary and help me win in the general, will certainly be to take on those fights and fight those fights unabashedly, but I'm going to do it primarily by focusing on what's possible, on what works, on the amazing upwelling of community resistance and of community positive developments that's happening from the coal fields to the most agricultural parts of the region, clear on up to our academic and university communities. We had a hemp forum yesterday, the second hemp forum that we've had. Between the two, one in Duffield and one yesterday in Abingdon, nearly 150 people came out, most of them farmers, many of them Republican farmers, because they know that we need to continue to develop opportunities for family farmers, for small businesses, and hemp is but one of several things that could possibly contribute to that.
Yes.
We've done town halls where we focused on millennials. And we have, I will have to say, we have with us here tonight some of our both interns and just strong supporters. And there's nothing more encouraging and more exciting to see young people who not only care, because I know plenty of young people who care, but young people who care and have not given up on the political process, even though they've got every reason to have done so. Because in your lifetime, I mean, let's be honest, in your lifetime, how much good stuff can we really point to that the political process has delivered for you, your families, and your communities? So hats off to you for sticking with it and for fighting back in spite of a pretty bad kind of base of experience about our political system. I'm very excited about the possibilities of what our millennials and young people can and will do. So you have people from the left and the right, farmers and landowners, conservatives and liberals, who together have pretty well united for the most part along the pathway in counties throughout the New River Valley and beyond into the neighboring district to say, this isn't going to benefit us. It's going to hurt us. It's going to hurt our land. It's going to jeopardize our clean water. It presents a potential danger of explosions in communities and neighborhoods like Bent Mountain. And for the most part, they've been speaking to a deaf ear in the terms of our state regulatory agencies, but also the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. And so we have FERC, which is supposed to be in the business of really reviewing and screening these pipeline projects to ensure that whatever the risks might be, the benefits outweigh the risks. But now we've come to find out that out of some 300 or 400 projects over the last few years, 2 have been denied by FERC. 2. And we've also come to learn that something on the order of 3/4 of all former FERC commissioners, the people who make the decision, when they've left FERC, close to 3/4 have gone to work for the pipeline and energy companies they were supposed to be regulating, which is what happens in the banking industry. It's what happens throughout our government, and it's not right, and it is not working. Some of this sedimentation and erosion that's so obvious and so far beyond what MVP said they would do. We've had the DEQ finally get involved and look at maybe bringing some stronger action. So there are some things in the work, not to mention lawsuits. So I think, I'll just say this, like a lot of other things, a few weeks ago with Red Terry and Minor Terry and the Tree and Nutty and others, in spite of all that, it looked like it was pretty well a lost cause. And now I think there's reason to hope that we may yet be able to stop the MVP. For me, by the time, if I win, by the time I get in, this particular critically important issue in the region may or may not be resolved for good or for bad. What I think about this is that, first of all, it's 2 things to me. One is we have to revisit what eminent domain really is for. And we we slid from an understanding that goes way back to the founding of the Republic, in which there had to be public use, which meant people directly were utilizing. If it was a railroad that took your land or a road or something like that, there were still takings, but it had to be directly used by the public, to about 50 years ago shifting over towards a public benefit understanding. And then that's become, over time, equated more and more with if it creates some jobs and creates some tax revenue, that's enough public benefit for the agencies that are supposed to be monitoring it. We need to retighten our understanding of it, and eminent domain should only be exercised for truly public benefit, when a substantial number of The other thing we need to do is we need to completely rethink FERC, and Senator Kane is somebody who's begun to ask for that, among others. Again, the revolving door of FERC commissioners, moving from there to the very entities they were regulating. Of course, again, that is throughout the entirety of the government. That's not unique to FERC. But there are some things specifically in the Gas Act that affect eminent domain, that put FERC in a position where it's almost like a super authority. And I think we need to really look closely at FERC and its role. And they also need to evaluate projects in the total rather than evaluating only each individual pipeline, because they're driving us towards a situation where we're very likely to be terribly overbuilt on these pipelines, and they'll be underused, and yet the taxpayers will still be on the hook for ensuring a return to those investors. 4 times as much per dollar asset as the big banks to small businesses and local communities. 4 times as much. So yeah, let's do what we can to allow them to do what they do, to loan. But this bill, not only are we not reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act to put some protection between investment and banking, between speculation and banking, but this banking bill promises to allow the big banks to jump up to the mega banks and avoid the stronger regulations of Dodd-Frank. Already, in anticipation of that bill passing, a buying spree is going on with mid-sized banks buying smaller banks. So the very bill that started out supposedly protecting community banks is accelerating the consolidation and buying up of community banks. That doesn't just hurt the folks working in the community banks, that hurts our businesses, our communities, our homeowners. And I don't know about you, but I think that's not right, and it's not working.
It's not working.
A study just came out 2 or 3 days ago from the United Way's Alice Project that said 3 Americans, 3, own a little more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population, 160 million people. 3. Now, what have we done recently to address inequality? We've passed a tax bill, 80% or more of which benefits went to those 3 people and a few thousand others that already are doing quite well. Yet another time that we've decided to give a lot to those who already have so much. And I don't know about you all, but I think that's not right, and it's not working. It's not working.
Yeah.
This morning, maybe yesterday morning, the Supreme Court handed down a decision about class action lawsuits and the ability of employees to bring class action lawsuits, or just more fundamentally, not to be forced into arbitration. And yet again, the Supreme Court sided with big corporations and not with working people. This isn't the first time. This is a pattern of not only this Supreme Court, but the last couple of Supreme Courts. So now, arbitration, which workers lose at 70% of the time, they have now been given the green light, the biggest corporations in the country, to force more workers into arbitration. And not only does that have an impact on wages, but that means that companies, and I'm not saying all companies are irresponsible, but companies who are irresponsible about workplace discrimination, about sexual harassment, about on-site accidents, anything like that, if it doesn't bring some other sort of action by a federal agency, they can now cover it up because workers have agreed not to talk through these forced arbitration clauses. And I don't know about you, but I think that's not right, and it's not working.
It's not.
Some more regional issues. We've got an opioid crisis that you all are fully aware of. I know a number of you are working in it, trying to help resolve it.
Yeah.
And we've got some very good things underway that are providing both treatment and rehabilitation. That's where we need to be putting our focus. But we just learned this morning that the president's new consigliere, Rudy Giuliani,
What a
in
joke.
fact, defended Purdue Pharma and enabled Purdue Pharma, when strong action was in the offing from the Department of Justice, enabled, first of all, nobody from Purdue to go to jail, but also allowed them to continue selling OxyContin and the other opioid drugs through the Medicare, Medicaid, and VA program. They were on the verge, because of what the Justice Department proved they had done to deceive the American people and to help foment this crisis. They were on the verge of not only having stiff fines and perhaps jail time for the senior executives, but they were no longer going to be allowed to peddle their pharmaceuticals through the U.S. government, Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA. But Mr. Giuliani worked a deal, so they have continued, as the opioid crisis has grown, to not only go unpunished, but to continue to make billions of dollars. And I don't know about you, but I think that's not right, and it's not. Town halls I held was with the Washington County Virginia Education Association. It was a group of about a dozen teachers that day that came out. That's the school system my wife Lori taught in for 31 years. And they invited me to come. Some local education associations won't. They're afraid about whatever perceptions of partisanship, but they invited me to. And I just said, okay, here's who I am, and I'm interested in your point of view about the state of our education system. And that's all it took to open the floodgates for, a solid hour and a half. And I wouldn't call it complaints, I would call it just justifiable, totally justifiable frustrations. And since then, we've not done another education or public education town hall, although we intend to, but I've encountered, met, talked with teachers at our other town halls. I also went and participated in the TRIO conference that was at Whitfield Community College, which is educators working to create a pipeline of students who have not gone to college before, come from families that are struggling. So the education issue is big. And, the issues are this. Basically, it comes down to chronic underfunding, a sort of 2 or maybe 3-tiered, but we'll say 2-tiered system, so that there are some communities with a very vibrant local economy and strong property tax bases in their school systems, at least from a funding point of view, are doing well. That doesn't mean that some of those well-funded school systems aren't also struggling with the tyranny of testing. But at least they can also offer a fuller range of options beyond that in music, arts, outdoor experience, and experiential. So in Southwest Virginia, in places like here, you've got both chronic underfunding, you've got federal mandates, many of which are counterproductive. And what the teachers have been saying to me is, you know, stop with the mandates and give us some money. And so I think basically it's time for us to just recognize that this approach to funding our children's education, which is so reliant on the relative affluence of the community those kids are born into, it ain't working. We need the federal government to step in, not with clever races to the top or No Child Left Behind. We need the federal government to simply put in the money, the sort of bridge funding between what the school systems have now, whether they're Montgomery or Wise or Grayson County, and where they need to be to have well-funded teachers who will make a career out of it, stay with it, and at the same time free them up to teach creatively, experientially, to teach in a way that kids that works for kids. Lori taught a lot of different subjects. She taught math to kids with learning disabilities. She taught all the grades of elementary. She finished her career teaching fine arts. But throughout all of that, she always was a very project learning, experiential learning person. And whether you're teaching a kid who's struggling to learn math, or whether you're teaching them about theater and the arts, being able to engage their whole body, not just some part of their brain, is so much more effective. We know that. You know, we know that's the way to teach. And we've spent far too long with the tyranny of testing. So I believe we need to move away from testing, move towards that kind of project-based learning, experiential learning, and we need to put money in there. It's like everything else. People say, where's the money going to come from? Well, if we start ticking off the money that we won't be spending on unemployment insurance and incarceration and all the other many things that are sort of a byproduct of bad schools, we'd probably end up pretty even, if not better. And speaking of money, yeah, all three of our kids have student debt, and they've sort of whittled away at a little of it. And in one case, one of our kids has a higher debt level now than when she finished her graduate degree, because she's not been able to even keep up with the interest payments. So young people are facing the double whammy when you go through a 4-year or even a master's degree, that it's so much more expensive, unimaginably more expensive than it was when I went through school, and the job prospects are generally worse, depending on the place, of course, and the specific field, but as a whole. And some of you might have seen Michael Hobbs' article in Huffington Post back in the fall, and he looked at what it cost in 1980 and how much you'd have to work to pay for your 4 years of schooling. And on average, a minimum wage job at that time, you'd have to work about 320 hours at that minimum wage job to pay for a year of education at a public university. Now that figure is over 4,000 hours, so 2 years of work at a minimum wage job to pay for a year of schooling. So, you know, it's really out of whack. Now, what's the solution to that? Well, one, we have to deal with like healthcare, the fact that the cost of a public university is just sort of mind-bogglingly and kind of unfathomably expensive. And why is that? What are the layers within our universities that have perhaps created unnecessary costs? What is all that? We got to deal with that. But in the short run, there's two things I think we can do. Both of them are totally sensible. One is to expand and reinvigorate our public service learning programs, our student debt programs that allow people who take a public service job in a nonprofit or teaching or doing what their occupation is in an underserved part of the country to get debt relief. Now, we already have that in place. The problem is you've got to make payments for several years, in some cases 10, in some cases 5 years before you begin to qualify for that debt relief. We need to beef up those public interest programs, public service programs, so that debt relief comes much sooner in the cycle, basically immediately. Second thing is a bill that was proposed, I think, in 2016 called the PAY Act, Pay As You Earn, which would just take all debt, student debt, and make the repayment obligation 10% of the person's income after a minimum threshold of covering sort of basic needs. So if you needed X amount for basic housing, food, gas, etc., above that you would pay 10%. And what that would mean, of course, is that people who get out and get great jobs in whatever, in engineering and finance, whatever, they would pay off their loan pretty quickly. But somebody's piecing together a living, as so many of our young people do, with a half-time job here and a three-quarter-time job there, they would be paying what they could afford, which is 10% of their income. I think that makes complete sense. We're not going to get that passed if we keep turning over more and more of student debt to private banking interests. It should be publicly held debt, because it's going to be a heck of a hard sell to private banks to take their loan repayments much more slowly. But that, I think, is gun control. So I'm a gun owner. As a farmer, I need a gun, and I have no interest whatsoever in eliminating the Second Amendment or abridging it. I believe that people should have the right to own guns. I think the problem has been that we have, and this is a relatively recent phenomenon, but we being the public generally, and then certainly the NRA and other groups like that, because there are gun groups that are more to the right than the NRA, but they have managed to convince a lot of people that any form of gun regulation is an attack on the Second Amendment. And so our effective policy on guns and gun violence in this country has been a do-nothing, none-of-the-above strategy. We can look at it, we can say a lot of guns with a lot of firepower are too easily available. We can say we have a background check system that has far too many holes and loopholes and exceptions. We can say we have a problem with mental health, which is really very debatable about where that fits in, but at least we can talk about all those different things and talk about domestic violence, which is by itself a much, much greater cause. The school shootings and the public shootings, of course, are horrific. They're mind-blowing, they're depressing, they're all of that, but they're a tiny percent, less than 2% of the gun deaths. Domestic violence alone claims far more lives, mostly women and often children, than we have in the mass shootings. But we talk about all those things, and then our collective policy has been to do nothing about any of them. So what I believe is, first step is absolutely making the background check system truly universal. That's one piece of the solution. It's not the solution by itself. Second thing is to eliminate, which we almost got there, the prohibition on spending federal dollars to examine this problem, to study. We've had a prohibition on using federal dollars to study the causes and the solutions. That's been in place for 22 years. That's got to go. And the third is then to begin finally to rein in some of the extreme firepower. Bump stocks, large magazine clips, some level for sure of regulation on semi-automatic weapons. It's hard to know exactly what the right threshold is, what's a magazine clip that's too big. It's kind of down in the weeds. But the fact is, it's just been growing exponentially, and surely the founders could not have envisioned the kind of firepower that the average person would have, and surely they would not have sanctioned that kind of firepower being so readily available. So I think those Southwest Virginia are sorely lacking. We're either behind, or we never had it, or we had it and it's in disrepair. So we've got that situation with a number of roads. We've got that with some maintenance of some of our bridges. We've certainly got it in some water systems. We've got it in broadband. So solving broadband is going to be an expensive thing. And the likelihood that we'll simply get line items for it, or the Appalachian Regional Commission fund what we need. We might get grants here and there, low interest loans, but it's not going to be enough. So increasingly, I'm thinking to the whole panoply of infrastructure that we need to look at a bond-funded national infrastructure bank. We're not talking about taking money out of the general funds. We're talking about issued bonds. The estimates are we should be able to raise $2 to $3 trillion to get that bank launched. It would be modeled on prior versions of national banks. They wouldn't compete with local banks. It would simply be a very substantial source of capital that would allow us to really begin to deal with our infrastructure issues, and in the 9th District, broadband would be one of the biggest ones. On top of that, we also need to be welcoming and trying the new technologies that are emerging that make broadband both less expensive and that can reach communities that are up and down the hills much more easily. Things like these microcell towers and the white spaces technology. We have a staff member whose husband is a computer geeky guy, and he's pulling together. I started exploring this white spaces technology and pretty quickly found out that I was getting in over my head. So Ernie is looking into this for us, and it's a very exciting, very low-cost technology that's particularly well-suited to rural communities generally. I don't know if there's anything we've done in the last 16 years there that was really right and just, to be perfectly honest. We made a mess of things that were already bad. So we could talk a lot about the Iraq War, we could talk a lot about the ways in which our steps, whether well-intended or not, and I'm certainly not sure they always are, have fueled anger and frustration. But when it comes down to the issue of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we are, it seems to me, further than ever from anything like a two-state solution. We're further than ever from a place where the lives of Palestinians matter as much as the lives of Israelis. They clearly don't to American policymakers. And like everything else, it's a complex issue, and it's because it's been going on for almost 70 years now. It is 70 years. There's no easy fix to it, but I think the movement of the embassy was an unnecessary and provocative step that had the result that was totally predictable. It's a small piece of a lot of bad decisions. I don't know the precise policy answers to it, except to say that there has to be a way to ensure Israel's safety, the safety of Israelis and of the nation, without embracing somebody like Benjamin Netanyahu, who is as close to ethnic cleansing as it gets.
Yeah, that's right.
And we have gotten to the point where criticizing the Israeli Defense Force or Israel is an extremely difficult thing to do in this country, to have a rational debate with these strategic questions. Financial need. Yeah, we're attempting to raise a good bit of money, and we have raised a good bit of money. We need to pick that pace up. And what I've found is that although an awful lot of people are very excited about this campaign, I think that's a fair statement, a self-serving one, but fair nevertheless. While a lot of folks are excited about it, the combination of, well, you got to win the primary first, is holding some folks back. And the second piece is that there's simply a ton of Democrats running in Virginia and around the country. And so a lot of people, if they're not immediately in the 9th District, who might otherwise support us, they've got 2 or 3 or 4 people in their own district they're trying to figure out what to do about it. That's the reality. So what we're doing, our fundraising strategy really comes down to maybe 3 things. One is we hold fundraising events, house parties, we call them. And any help, anybody here, I know there's at least a couple of people in the room that have already committed to or held those events. There are others who've committed to doing them over the next few weeks and months. And you strategies. And then the third is we're looking for particular groups of people, brand new Congress, our revolution, our some. We're looking in particular parts of the country, people who have an affinity for sustainability or for rural progressives, and we're trying to find like-minded folks that also might help us. I'll just say, when we get to the strategy part of this meeting, we need, the well-to-do have bundlers, people who, because of the way our campaign finance laws work, will talk to their well-to-do friends and get a half a dozen or a dozen of them to each commit $1 million to their super PAC. We can't do that by federal law. But we can bundle at the grassroots. If everybody in this room could think of 10 people that they could persuade to give $10 a month, or 50, or 100, or 200, or whatever your friends' means are, we could take this task that falls primarily on the candidate and make it our task. We could bundle at the grassroots. So there's a lot of creative things we're looking at as well.